Perfect. So, welcome everybody. Welcome to the session on EPC reform, what's changing and why it matters. Thank you again for taking out time this afternoon and coming and speaking and listening to this really important topic in all our net zero lives. But just a quick introduction, who we are. I'm Akshata. I lead on net zero engagement at TPAS Cymru, and with me is also David.
Hello.
You might have met David or seen David in a lot of sessions, but he leads on essentially TPAS. He's the chief exec, but he's also really passionate about net zero. So he will be supporting me today on this session. A bit of housekeeping before we proceed. The chat section is for you, but it will be monitored throughout the session. If you've got any views or if you've got anything to add, please make sure that you add that, and we will make sure that we take that forward during the end of the discussion. All the resources, including slides, presentation, will be shared afterwards, so that's rest assured. But a lot of you are joining us for the first time, so I think it's really good on our part to tell who we are. So, who are TPAS Cymru? We are a Welsh Government appointed national organisation for tenant engagement in Wales. We make sure that tenant voice is at the heart of all the housing policies. We work and support with all the housing landlords, including housing associations, local authorities, community projects, and also supported housing providers. We essentially are like a bridge between landlords and tenants, if I can say that. But why do we care about net zero at TPAS and why does it matter? It would sound pretty obsessed if I say that because I lead on net zero, but I think it is really fair to say that net zero is the biggest challenge we have in front of us and also an opportunity for Wales and also for housing for the next 20 years. At TPAS, we do sessions, events like Net Zero Week, where we aim to bring together the housing providers in Wales to tackle this big challenge and achieve that affordable warmth, which is really a dream for all of us. And to do that, we share best practices, we do project management, network session, and case studies, which is essentially videos and a lot of other things we could do to sort of take that tenant voice forward. So if you have anything interesting coming, which we could sort of come and visit, make a video for tenants, please do get in touch. But a lot of our work is also sharing resources, sharing those best practices, which is really a big need, a need of the hour. So we've created a Padlet page where we have gathered all the resources for the Welsh Housing Quality Standard, which is a big challenge for all of us. But also we are looking forward to make more of these pages for tenant basics, net zero stuff. So if you've got any literature we could add in here, again, please do get in touch. And we would love to do that and work and make this a big asset for all of us. We also hear directly from tenants through our Tenant Pulse, which is our national platform for Wales, where we listen to tenants and renters on matters which matter to them the most. They are usually annual surveys, topical surveys. It could also be short surveys, but the latest was Tenant Pulse on affordable warmth and energy efficiency, which we just closed yesterday. And I'm really looking forward to analyzing the report, which will come next month. Just on the tenant pulse, there was a really interesting angle on EPC, which came last year, where we asked tenants if they know EPC of their home, and 92% of the people said that they have seen something like this, but it was only 29% who actually knew what it is, which really shows lack of awareness and also a need for that information bridge gap. But a quick one on EPC reform and why is it needed, and why are we basically here and discussing this? There's been a lot of discussion and confusion around are we measuring the right thing? Are we doing it right? Do we have confidence in it? And I think there's been a common consensus with everyone and each one of us on this call that we don't trust EPC and there is lack of trust on both landlords and tenants. And I think as TPAS, we really would like to see EPC as a food hygiene rating, but it seems like the trust is missing. When you see these articles about EPC, it really shows that we need a reform. And so at TPAS, a key areas for us are EPC metrics, the validity, which is being proposed to reduced from 10 years, rent compliance, also expanding EPC to HMOs and heritage buildings, and also quality, which then would help us in regaining that trust. So these are some areas I'm really looking forward to create a response from TPAS. But I think there's been a lot of conversation on Reddit as well, where people have been raising their concerns around assessments and also quality and the pricing that the assessors not doing properly could be because of the salary. So there's been a lot of confusions, but to all break that down and to really understand what we have in front of us in terms of that reform, we have Faye from Energy System Catapult. And without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to her and she would really, really explain us what this consultation is about and why is it needed. Over to you, Faye.
Right. Thanks, Akshita, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak to all of your members today. I will should be able to quickly share some slides. She's there. Can you see those, or is that still showing the presenter view?
If you switch it on the display settings,
Yeah,
it'll
sorry.
just be easier for both sides.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, the Zoom bit is over that option. There we go. Should be able to. Sorry about that. It's a technical
That's it. Perfect. Thanks.
Great. So as she said, I'm Faye. I'm from Energy Systems Catapult, and I work on work around heat and buildings policy, and specifically have done quite a lot of work over the last 18 months or so around EPC reform. So I'll start with a quick introduction to Energy Systems Catapult for those that don't know who we are, what we do. We're an independent, not-for-profit organisation. We're established by Innovate UK about 7 or 8 years ago. So we get some kind of core funding, public funding via that. But we also work with a range of partners in the public and private sectors. And our mission is to accelerate net zero innovation. So we work right across the energy system on different topics and different approaches. I'm part of our markets policy and regulation team, so we do a lot of kind of thought leadership where we're thinking about kind of the future of policy, what it needs to look like. We contribute policy expertise, and we do a lot of engagement with policymakers and with other stakeholders like yourselves. So yeah, we have a range of focuses at the Catapult on different scales, but the one that's obviously most relevant for today is our focus around homes. And the focus there is really to make it easy and desirable for people to decarbonise homes. So whether that's kind of owner-occupiers looking to decarbonise their own homes, private landlords, or social housing organisations and local authorities that are thinking about how to decarbonise their housing stock and how to not only decarbonise but obviously address some of the problems we have around energy performance that lead to fuel poverty and the associated kind of health and social problems that can cause. So what are EPCs? What are energy performance certificates? As she said, probably most people are familiar with them, and I know lots of you work in the kind of housing where you'll be dealing with them a lot. So this will probably be familiar to lots of you, but energy performance certificates we've had in the UK since 2007. They were introduced following a European directive, and really the kind of original purpose was allowing people to compare properties when they're looking to buy or rent a property, to understand a bit about what the energy performance is, what the bills are going to be like in different properties. So you have these kind of A to G scales, lots of people familiar with the kind of different colour charts and what those look like. And over time, since 2007, they've been used extensively in policy and to determine eligibility for retrofit funding. So now we see kind of EPCs being referenced in fuel poverty policy and definitions. They're used for kind of net zero policy, which obviously back in 2007 was not as much of a focus. So they're kind of being used for more and more purposes that they weren't kind of originally designed for. EPCs are based on modelled energy performance. So some of you be familiar with the Standard Assessment Procedure, or SAP, which is the kind of model that underlies the EPC. So the kind of domestic energy assessor would go to a home, if it's an existing home, and do a kind of visual inspection, take some measurements, input data about that property, and the model will then provide an output around the EPC rating. So you get that rating, and the EPC also contains some recommendations for how to improve the rating. So why is reform needed? As Ikshita was saying, there's quite a lot broad recognition in the sector and from government that there are problems with existing EPCs, that they're not working as well as they could for all of the purposes that we're now trying to use them for. We did a bit of work a bit over a year ago. We published a report where we can identify 3 main areas of problems. Firstly, around inaccuracy and inconsistency. So there's a bit of a performance gap between what the model and what the ratings say about how much energy is used in a property, and actually what the kind of lived experience of people in that property is. EPCs are based on a kind of standardized assumptions about occupancy and how often, how many people live in the house, how often they put the heating on, and so on. So, you wouldn't expect them to always match up completely with energy bills, because obviously different households are different. But there's kind of quite a lot of work around that has identified that there's not a lot of kind of correlation. There's a bit of a performance gap, and some inconsistency as well, and some of that is driven by the assessment process. Some of the data that's input isn't always completely accurate, and that can lead to a bit of inconsistency as well. Lack of alignment with net zero is a problem. So we looked at all the kind of recommendations for properties that have had EPCs and found that 1/4 of them were recommending that new gas boilers should be installed, which obviously may have benefits in terms of energy costs and fuel poverty, but are not very well aligned with net zero, where governments across the UK are trying to incentivize low carbon heating technology, like heat pumps. Actually, sometimes EPCs are getting in the way of that, or recommendations are going in the opposite direction. And they're also not very well aligned with wider energy system needs. So EPCs tend to treat a house in isolation. They just look at that one property. They don't take into account the wider local energy system capacity, and they don't look at things like flexibility. So that's matching up energy demand, or the times and places that energy is used, with when the times and places where energy is available on the grid. So we have a move to more and more renewables, and wind turbines, like we've got in David's background picture, are playing a much bigger role in generation. That becomes increasingly important, when and where we use energy. And at the moment, EPCs don't really kind of consider those features. So the government published a consultation at the start of December. So they'd been kind of talking about this for a few years and had a kind of EPC action plan. And I think that consultation covers England and Wales. There's been a separate consultation in Scotland where the kind of EPCs are devolved and the design of that. So there's a kind of parallel process going on there. But yeah, one of the key themes of the consultation is the metrics that are used in EPCs. So the current metrics, we have a single headline metric, which is the energy efficiency rating. It's a bit of confusing terminology, because even though it's called the energy efficiency rating, it's actually a cost-based metric. And that's one of the reasons why you see a lot of recommendations for gas boilers over electrified heating solutions like heat pumps, because of what's known as a spark gap. The difference in unit cost for electricity and gas means that the model can kind of find that heat pumps or electrified heating are more expensive and therefore isn't recommended. So there's that single headline rating, and that is the one that's used for regulatory purposes. So it's used in the fuel poverty space, it's used in net zero, and the minimum energy efficiency standards for the private rented sector, they refer to this kind of EPC rating, which is the energy efficiency rating. There is more information on EPCs, and there's also environmental impact rating, which is included and which is based on the carbon emissions from the property. So you do have that information on the EPC, but it's not really being used at the moment. When people talk about kind of targets or regulation in terms of EPCs, they're almost always referring to the energy efficiency rating. So the consultation considers a range of potential metrics. So this is kind of the full list that is set out in the consultation. So they talk about a carbon metric, which would be similar to the existing environmental impact rating that would estimate the carbon emissions arising from the energy used. So, see the emissions intensity of fossil fuels would be higher. Electricity would reflect how electricity is generated at the moment, the carbon intensity of the grids, or could be thought about in different ways if you kind of were to think about the future of clean power and decarbonising electricity. You could kind of factor that into a carbon metric. That's kind of one option they've set out. There's the option of an overall energy use metric, which would just be a kind of measure of how much energy that would be used to heat and light the property, based on kind of standardized occupancy. They talk about an energy cost metric, which would be how much would the bills be based on that kind of standardized energy use, and a measure of that. So again, that would take into account the different costs of different types of energy, for so that kind of gas, electricity. They talk about a fabric performance metric, so that would be much more focused on the heat loss of the building, and would be based on measure that, so possibly the heat transfer coefficient, or another kind of modelled measure of how good the property is at retaining heat, essentially, and how well insulated it is. Exploring a smart readiness metric, so this would look at the building's potential to integrate smart technologies that can optimize energy consumption. So that might be things like a smart meter, smart EV charger, battery storage, smart heating controls and things like that. So really look at that kind of the presence of things that would allow the household to participate in flexibility services, like the kind of demand side response services, where people might be able to kind of benefit from time of use tariffs and things like that. And they also talk about a heating system metric. So this is an option that was put forward by the Climate Change Committee, where they've suggested that the metric could be based on a ranking system of different heating systems, with low carbon, highly efficient systems such as heat pumps at the top, followed by kind of low carbon but less efficient systems like direct electric heating, and then going down towards the less efficient fossil fuel systems as the kind of lower rated options. So the government's consultation sets out their kind of preference for which metrics should be included as headline metrics in the EPC, and their kind of favoured solution is to have 4, which would be energy cost, the fabric performance, the heating system, and then smart readiness. And they've talked about the different ways you could use those metrics, or combinations of those metrics, to drive the kind of changes that are needed in properties to address net zero, but also to address fuel poverty and other outcomes. So the Catapult, we have a slightly different view to what's been proposed in terms of what we think would be most useful for regulators. And that's really because, we've had conversations with the department around this, and they want to make EPCs a much more useful kind of regulatory tool for net zero and for improving standards of housing. And we feel that if that's your goal, having a carbon metric is perhaps the best way to do that, because it focuses on the outcome that you're trying to achieve rather than we have some concerns about the heating system metric in terms of it being quite focused on different technologies and potentially incentivizing households to put in a heat pump, even if it's not the best solution or it's not a very good quality install. So, you could have a badly performing heat pump that's not delivering a good outcome for the people that live in the property, but that would still get a really good score on a heating system metric. So we've kind of preferred to suggest using carbon as that metric to really drive net zero policy and be a bit more straightforward for people to understand and make choices about the best way to reduce carbon in their property. And we've also suggested the overall energy use metric would be useful in preference to having the separate heating system and fabric metrics, really because, again, that kind of focuses on the outcome of reducing the amount of energy used and would allow people to make this evidence-based decisions about the property and the best pathway to improving its energy performance and reducing its carbon. So, in some properties you might have higher potential fabric performance, or you might be able to do more around insulation without causing some of the problems that we sometimes see around damp and mold. And that'd be great. In other properties, there might be less you could do with the fabric, but actually you can still install a really efficient heating system and reduce energy use in that way. So yeah, we had some concerns around regulating on the basis of fabric performance and heating systems, maybe incentivizing people to make decisions based on that regulation, not based on kind of the best path forward for that property. But we do think it's useful to have energy cost, and we do think it's useful to have that kind of smart readiness indicator. Although we know that is a bit of a more nebulous concept for a lot of consumers, they might not understand as instinctively kind of what the smart readiness means. So I think there's a bit of work maybe around that, around communicating what do we mean by smart readiness and why should people really care? What's the benefit to consumers of having that kind of smart technology in their homes, which should be, that enables them to access kind of bill savings and so on. But I realize it's a complex thing to communicate, and people maybe aren't used to thinking about their properties in that way. So yeah, that's our kind of views and how we'll be responding to the consultation. But I'm sure lots of you have different views, and yeah, very interested to hear that in this discussion. Some of the other topics that are covered by the consultation are, I think as she mentioned, reducing the validity period from 10 years. So at the moment, if you have, say you get an EPC for the purposes of renting out a property, that EPC is then valid for 10 years, no matter kind of if changes have been made, or if you kind of rent it out again within that period, you don't need a new EPC. The government are consulting on reducing that. They set out a range of options for the length of time, 2 years, 5 years, 8 years. I think from our point of view, we would like to see EPCs move to being as close to live as possible, so that there's more trigger points if you make significant changes to the property, if you change the heating system, and so on, that they should be updated at that point so that we can keep them as up to date as possible. And yeah, we've kind of explored different ways of doing that with the data. It also talks about introducing methods for measuring the thermal performance of homes, which I think is really important to address some of those issues around accuracy, consistency, trust in the system. And the government's done some work around the SMETA program, which stands for, I believe, Smart Meter Enabled Thermal Efficiency Ratings, where it's really about kind of using that smart meter data and temperature monitoring to directly measure the heat loss of a building rather than relying on the model, which could potentially be quite a powerful change. It also talks about requiring all heritage buildings to have an EPC. So there are currently some exemptions for protected buildings. And I know some kind of heritage building organisations have had some concerns about the EPC's recommendations leading to inappropriate measures being installed. So the consultation also talks about changes to the EPC calculation to address that and make sure that recommendations are appropriate and in line with what's possible with a heritage building. They also talk about existing EPC data being used for minor upgrades. So at the moment, if you have an EPC done, essentially every time you have it done on the same property, the process starts from the start. A domestic energy assessor will come around and do the full survey. So yeah, they're looking into ways of updating them more using existing data. So if you just did a small change, like perhaps putting heating controls in a property, or something that was quite a discrete change, then you could use the data from the last assessment and update the EPC rating that way. But if you were doing more significant changes, then there might still be a need for a full kind of reassessment. They also talk about energy assessor training standards and accreditation. So possibly giving the accreditation schemes more power to oversee training or sole responsibility for providing it, as a way of addressing concerns about quality, which I think is a kind of really live issue and potentially a positive step. I think our view is there could have maybe been more ambition in the consultation around that. And it also touches on improving enforcement and increasing penalties. There are a few proposals that are specific to the rental sector. So requiring a valid EPC throughout a tenancy period, not just when the property is advertised for let. So if the EPC runs out while you have tenants in place, then there would be a kind of requirement to have a new EPC done rather than just wait until the next time the property is let. Extending the scope so that an EPC is required for a whole house of multiple occupation when a single room is let out, which I think is an important step towards perhaps closing a loophole that had existed in the private rented sector, with some of the talk about increased minimum energy efficiency standards, which I'll come on to. There had seen a bit of kind of commentary from landlords on forums talking about, we'll just make the property a HMO to get around these requirements. Whereas, yeah, this consultation would close that loophole a little bit. And again, introducing a requirement for short-term rental properties to have an EPC. And also, I spoke about that change of requiring all heritage buildings to have an EPC. That would mean that then if a heritage building is being rented out on the private rental market, it would then be within scope of the minimum energy efficiency standards for private rented properties. So that would kind of have an implication there. So the current consultation closes next week. It closes on the 26th. And it is, I'd say, a bit of a high-level consultation. They're consulting on some of those metrics and design ideas around a reformed EPC. And there will be a second consultation that will look more at the methodology. So they're currently replacing SAP with the home energy model, and then the EPC will be the kind of one of the outputs that methodology can create. So they'll have a more detailed consultation on that methodology. with a view to introducing the new style EPCs in the second half of 2026. And then there would be a bit of a transition period because they're talking about existing EPCs remaining valid. And that is something they ask about in the consultation. But yeah, if they were to remain valid for 10 years, you potentially have a 10-year period where you have old style EPCs and new style EPCs like sitting alongside each other, which I think is quite a long period. So I think perhaps our view would be maybe you would shorten that a little bit so that perhaps around 2030 or something you could shift to entirely to the new system. And yeah, I've been talking for quite a while, but I'll do a quick overview of the minimum energy efficiency standards consultation, which also came out in the last couple of weeks, which applies to the private rented sector in England and Wales. Know that the current minimum energy efficiency standard is EPC-E. There's been a lot of talk over the last few years about increasing that to EPC-C. It's something that the last government proposed to do and then consulted on and then sort of dropped and found that there's quite a lot of opposition from landlords and they in the private sector and didn't do it. The new government has recommitted to doing that and they published a consultation, and I think it's really kind of a good illustration of how the new metrics they're consulting on might be used, or kind of a good test case for that. So what they're proposing to do is move from the current cost-based metric with the energy efficiency rating to a kind of a two-stage standard. So the primary standard they've suggested would be based on the fabric performance metric. So that would be really trying to incentivize a fabric first, insulation first approach, which they've said they would set at a C on that fabric performance metric, which would be broadly in line with the current EPCC. And then once the property achieves that fabric performance standard, landlord would be required to invest towards a secondary standard, and they would have a choice around that, which is very generous of them. They'd be able to choose whether they want to focus on the smart readiness metric, so installing more kind of smart energy appliances, or whether they want to focus on the heating system metric, so upgrading the heating system to meet a higher standards. And the cost cap for that would be increased to 15,000. So that would be the maximum amount landlords are required to invest to meet both standards. So yeah, if you'd already spent 15,000 meeting the primary standard, then you wouldn't be required to spend more on meeting the second one, or vice versa. Yes, if you'd already met the first standard, investment would then be focused on meeting the second metric. And yeah, for the social rented sector, the UK government has talked about doing a similar measure for the social rented sector. And in England, they're looking at that as part of the Decent Homes Standards review, which is expected later in the year. I think, and I'm sure people here will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Welsh Housing Quality Standard already includes the kind of EPCC by 2030 requirements. So yeah, ahead of the game there in Wales compared to where England's got to. But yeah, it sounds like the ambition from the UK government is to have the same kind of approach in the Decent Home Standards for England at some point. And yeah, that's what's the kind of end of my presentation. Thank you for listening to me talk on. It's a lot of information, but yeah, happy to answer questions and really keen to hear the discussion.
Thank you, Faye. You were great. And I think you've sort of really made the EPC reform simple and really, really good and understanding for everybody on this call. And I'm sure it was really useful. At least for me, it was. I was really keen to sort of know your specified metrics as well, which is being pointed out in the chat. So that was really useful for me. And I'm really keen to write my response now after this. But we've got some comments in the chat, which I'm sure you'd be keen to answer. There is one from Phoebe, which is how is this likely to relate to the release of SAP 10, which we are anticipating in the first half of 2025? Would the methodologies likely be bolted on alongside or need to be incorporated within the new SAP 10 methodology?
Yeah, so touched on this a little bit, but yeah, the new kind of home energy model that the government consulted on last year is kind of going to be a replacement for the full SAP. There's also the RD SAP, which is the kind of reduced version, which is used for existing properties. So yeah, full SAP is used for new build properties,
Yeah.
and then you have the reduced version. So yeah, there is a lot of complexity around those different methodologies that are used. The ambition is that the new style EPCs will be based around the new kind of home energy model methodology, which again, so there'll be a further consultation on exactly how that methodology kind of produces the outputs that are needed, and be a bit more of a technical consultation later this year. But yeah, so far the government's consulted on the home energy model, which is a kind of a full model equivalent to SAP. They haven't yet consulted, as far as I'm aware, on the kind of RD SAP equivalent of how it'll work for new properties. So yeah, that's a bit of uncertainty and a lot of work to be done around those, updating those methodologies and getting them ready for the new style EPCs when we move to that. But yeah, they have said hopefully by late 2026 we should be in a position where we've got new methodologies and we're working on a new EPC.
Thanks for that. But also, you specified some metrics, preferred headline metrics from Catapult perspective. Samantha is asking if you've already put down to the government or is it a part of your response? So, what are your plan of action to sort of take these metrics forward?
Yeah, so we have kind of shared our recommendations with government. So we published a report, I think it's December 2023, so a little while ago now, that kind of had those arguments that I made broadly, and we've had some meetings with them since. We aren't the only people with suggestions, and I think what's been proposed in the consultation is very strongly related to the Committee on Climate Change's recommendations. So unfortunately, they've listened more to them than to us at this stage. But yeah, we have had quite a bit of engagement with them more recently as well around especially the smart readiness metric, because that's something we'd done quite a bit of work on in partnership with the Centre for Net Zero around what we were calling a kind of smart building rating. So we're having quite a lot of dialogue with them around that. And yeah, we will obviously respond to the consultation and reiterate kind of our views, but obviously they may go forward with what they've proposed, and yeah, we'll try and work with them to make that as useful as possible if that's the way that things go.
It is an interesting space for sure, and I'm really, really looking closely into what happens after this. But I really hope this reform brings some positive change because it's much needed. But I think just on the smart meter, as you said earlier, there is a comment from Tim in the chat section who says, did you have any thoughts on incorporating smart metering technologies like meters into the energy performance assessment framework for buildings? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, we're really keen to see as much kind of direct measurement of building performance incorporated into the assessment framework and into EPCs as possible, because hopefully improving the model is great, but models are only ever kind of theoretical, and yeah, if you can actually measure what's going on in the building and how well the insulation is working or not working, that is going to give a more accurate representation. It's going to benefit, tenants or occupants, because it'll really reflect their experience rather than just kind of the model says this should be well insulated. So, it's fine. So yeah, technologies like meters, I think, have a really important place. Yeah, as a kind of input, something that we could do, let's say they're based on smart metering technology. So see, not every property has a smart meter at the moment, but lots of them do. And with a bit of kind of additional monitoring, you can potentially kind of roll out that direct measurement for more and more properties. Whereas in the past, the measuring the heat loss of a building was a bit more intrusive. People had to move out. It might take a few days. Whereas with meters, it can be done while people are in occupation. So yeah, there's different kind of technologies around. Meters technologies have different accuracies and stuff, but I think it's a really kind of promising area and something that we should definitely be trying to use as much as possible.
Thanks, Faye. I think you really make a good point on the fabric performance of the building as well, which is something all the tenants are really keen to know because of the affordable warmth and just fuel poverty just being so big problem in all our lives. But I'd like to bring in David here, who mentioned a really good point. We were discussing this last week on the EPC exemptions, which is a big loop, a big area when we speak of compliance and bridging that trust. If we have like 7 exemptions to an EPC, I just feel like it's like a big door you give people to just run away from
Uh,
the whole
Yeah, and
thing.
I'm glad to see that
Yeah.
we're looking at those 7 exemptions used to really annoy me because I felt they were gaping holes that were so easy to get an exemption on. And it was a subject that really was quite came across a lot in PRS renters um, when they were trying to understand why their property was so poor. So I was glad to see reform on that. Has it gone far enough, Faye, or do we need to be calling for more? How do we get that private rental sector up a bit without penalising landlords too far,
Yeah, it's a great question and something that we've been doing quite a lot of thinking around recently, with these kind of policy changes around minimum energy efficiency standards. And yeah, obviously the private rented sector has a lot higher fuel poverty than other sectors. There's a lot of kind of people really struggling with energy bills or being able to live in warm homes. And yeah, incentivizing landlords to make changes is really difficult because obviously if you're a landlord in the private rented sector, you own the property, you have to pay for measures to be installed, but you're not actually paying the energy bills a lot of the time. So the kind of benefits in terms of cost saving are going to the tenants. So, while we'd like to think that landlords would see the importance of it, sometimes they're looking at their bottom line and they're not always incentivized to invest. So I think the regulation is going to help with that. I think if we don't have the regulation, then we probably won't see a lot of change. But as you say, closing those loopholes, so things like the kind of HMO approach, or bringing kind of more heritage buildings into scope and stuff should help with that. I think we've got to be very careful about what other loopholes are created by some of these systems, or the cost cap. I think the cost cap was previously around £3,000. So if you'd spent that, you could get an exemption.
There was some weird tenant refused the work ones. We saw ones in Cardiff filed in the middle of lockdown, which was, the tenant refused the work, honest, and it was like, well, that's it, is it? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it is difficult because they can be disruptive to tenants. And so I guess there's that kind of engagement you need to do with both with the landlords, but also with the tenants to kind of make sure they appreciate the benefits. And obviously that kind of landlord-tenant relationship can be a difficult one. Like people don't always have loads of trust in their landlords to be doing something in their benefit. So it is a sensitive area, but hopefully.
I think in social housing, I think Phoebe's echoed my comment on the side there, is if we change some of the metrics on EPC and WHQS is driven by EPC, rightly or wrongly, then we're going to have to relook at the measurements and the deadlines and how we deliver WHQS. I think if
That
there
could
are significant
impact
change.
a lot of
Sorry,
things. Yeah.
Phoebe, is there anything you want to say on that?
No, I mean, I was
No.
just, in terms of, like you said, WHQS at the moment is sort of entirely based upon us completing EPCs for our entire stock, us being all of the registered social landlords in Wales, and generating target energy pathways based entirely off of that data. So if, I'm thinking about my team now who are doing that work, okay, great, we might do 1,000 properties worth this year, and then halfway through next year, the entire methodology changes. Is that going to then invalidate the 1,000 that we've done using the old methodology? And also, if the new methodology is completely different, that will need training, reintegration into, organizations, potentially more staff. It might take more time. And so that deadline that we've currently got, which is currently very firm, of having to deliver our whole stock assessment by March 2027, that surely is going to need to reflect it as well. So it just feels like a weird. It feels like they've asked us to do this thing. They've given us a set deadline for it. We've responded, and then now there's this possibility that the whole methodology could change anyway. Just seems like a weird order to have done things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is it's always a tension when there's so much that hangs off EPCs, and there's almost difficult to ever do it in a time that's not going to be disruptive. But I think they have proposed for that EPCs done under the existing methodology would potentially remain valid for as long as they would have been valid previously. So that would be 10 years. So I would imagine the EPCs that you've done now under the existing kind of system and methodology wouldn't suddenly become invalid. So I imagine the kind of arrangements could be made that those are still recognised. Appreciate that then you're working with new metrics, and kind of the Welsh government would probably need to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate, like it not being invalidated, and that sort of makes sense. I think it almost more so just sort of seems a shame that if they, if we get this new methodology, that ultimately, like I agree, it sounds better to be doing it from the perspective that you're looking at. It just seems a shame that almost half our stock is going to be under the old one that wasn't so good, and then another half will be under the new one, which is much better. It just seems a shame
And
from
the
that
pathway
perspective.
could be different then, couldn't it?
Completely different. If you've measured from a different perspective, then the target energy pathway is going to be completely different to what it was from the previous perspective. So it just seems, a shame in that respect. And I appreciate, obviously there is never a good time to do a massive change. However, I do feel that certainly Welsh Government at least would have known that WHQS 2023 was being released for a long time. And they must have also known that this reform was being looked at. So it just seems, it's a little bit, I think already a lot of Welsh landlords are feeling the challenge of what WHQS is asking of us. And now to be thinking, okay, well, that actually what we're doing now might be essentially this time next year or this time in a year and a half invalid or not the best way of doing it. Just seems a shame.
And I think you're right on that. I think we all agree the fact that so many people turned up today that I've never met many people who go, oh, EPC is perfect as it is. I think it did need to change, and I suppose WHQS couldn't wait. But it does feel like we're in a little bit of a limbo land now until we see what comes out of this. And it does, I think there will have to be conversations with Welsh Government about the deadlines and the pathways. And I hope to God we're not having to redo or relook at work. I'm not quite as confident as Fay with, which is the EPC will stay valid. I just think we might end up going down paths that aren't the right paths if we've changed the goalposts. I don't know. Does anyone else have views on this?
Sorry, I think it is something we should definitely take to the Welsh Gov. Perhaps Darren, who leads on WHQS, he will be the best person to comment on that. But equally said, on the EPC reform, on question 12, they do have something on if you have any views on the key transition. they've got a big paragraph on that whole section on how we will transition from this existing EPC to the new one. So if you're responding to it and if you've got views on it, I think that would be another place where you can sort of share about it. But I think Welshgov would have more of the authority to sort of make any changes. But I do feel the pressure and the stress here in this conversation about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely sounds like worth engaging Welsh Government, and there might be things that they could do in terms of, a transitional methodology, in terms of using the data that's been collected under the old system and kind of giving a bit of an indication of what that would look like with the new metrics, or, how the different pathways would be worked out based on the different things. So yeah, it's definitely something, I'll take back as well for our engagement work around like thinking about transitional things around this. And definitely sounds
I think it's just because there's a lot of good hard work going on in Wales. We had tougher, tight, faster deadlines, tougher deadlines. Rightly so. We need to decarbonise housing, but we just don't want to see that good work getting either lost or lose momentum or put on hold, because there's great work going on in Wales at the moment. So anybody, I'm sorry, taking over slightly actually the session, but we've got about 7 minutes left. Is there any other thoughts people have or comments they want to make?
Hello.
Hi, yeah, thank you. And thank you for this. It's been really, really helpful for me as I'm responding to it. And sorry, I was a little bit late coming on. I had some headphone issues, but I did just have a question about this is kind of to anyone and everyone about sort of the enforcement of, maybe new reforms or minimum energy efficiency standards in the private rented sector as well, and making sure that, landlords are making necessary changes to improve efficiency of homes. So we did some recent research into the EPC data of care and repair clients. We do predominantly support people in the owner-occupier sector, but we are seeing an increase of older people in the PRS. And I think by 2040, this is due to triple. The number of older people in the PRS is due to, grow massively. And our data show that I think about half of our clients are already in the PRS. The homes that they were living in did not meet the existing minimum energy efficiency standards. I will caveat with saying that that might include people living in homes that are owned by family and friends. So it's quite hard to say this is, landlords, but I think it's still quite telling. And I'm just wondering, is there any mention in the consultation or in response about resourcing to actually, enforce that, and who will actually be responsible for enforcing, landlords in doing this? Because, if it does come down to local authorities who are, obviously already extremely stretched with resource, who is actually doing that enforcement? I don't know. That's an open-ended question, but I just wanted to if anyone had any thoughts about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, because as you say, at the moment local authorities are struggling to enforce the MEES at EPCE. So bringing it up to EPCC, obviously there's going to be a whole other group of properties that needs kind of enforcement. It's not something I've looked into in loads of detail, but I've noticed some of the conversations I've had that with that kind of local authorities sometimes find it easier to enforce via the Housing Act and the kind of excessive colds requirements in that than the MEES regulations, because sometimes the housing teams are more used to working with kind of the Housing Act. But so there's probably upskilling, as you say, resourcing, and thinking about how can we do it more effectively. How can we use things like data around landlords and housing to identify more proactively properties that maybe aren't compliant.
There's also a transparency thing here, I think, Hannah, as well. We've done some work doing some work with some students in Cardiff around the transparency of EPCs in adverts, because you can go from one letting agent to the next in Cardiff student land, and one, is showing that EPC and the other one's not making any attempt to show it. And it makes a big difference, an EPC F or whatever versus a B or something. So there's got to be more transparency in this whole market and enforcement, as you say. So it's something we're trying to do work with some students at the moment on doing the legwork to show that even search engines as well, letting agents, the property sites, you can't search by EPC, but you can search for ridiculous categories. There's another rant, sorry, I'm going to come off that. It's another day for private rental sector, because most of the people here aren't private rental sector, but yeah, shut up. Actually, back to you, sorry.
No, but I think just as on the trust, I mean, it all comes back to that lack of trust, really. If we do not have enough compliance, just as Hannah said, I'm not sure how we are going to regain that trust. So obviously there needs to be authority sort of making sure that this happens and in right way. So that would really make that trust game happen. But anybody on this call, just as Hannah said, she is planning to respond. TPAS as well would respond to certain questions from tennis perspective. But if there's anybody on the call who is also planning to respond and has some other views or would like to share something with somebody on this call, then yeah, this is the time really. We'd love to hear from you. No?
They all want their lunch.
But yeah, we definitely hope it was useful for everybody on this call. I will make sure that I'll share the slides, the resources. If Faye's comfortable, we'll also share her slides, just so it's helpful for you to sort of shape your response. And we'll make our response public as well, just so you can have a view at that. And with that, I will just give it a close. But we really hope you find it useful. And thank you for your time this afternoon. Hope you have a great lunch.
Thank you, Faye. Cheers.